Okay, here we go, last part of this week's lecture. Now, many of you last week in your discussions, as I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, pointed out, you know what? I don't just, not only, a lot of you pointed out, hey, I don't watch The Bachelor, The Bachelorette, so maybe I'm not so hooked into mass culture. But then a lot of you also said, you know, I might watch that or I might have watched it, but it's not like I think that's how love happens or that I actually want to be with those people or be like those people. Instead, a lot of you were basically in resistance to a lot of the mass culture that you see running around in the world today. And in the 1970s, a lot of sociologists who had kind of been enthralled with kind of the Adorno-Horkheimer idea of mass culture, one culture industry, looked around and realized that there were lots of what we now would call subcultures who were not kind of just swallowing the pill, if you will, of mass culture, who actually seemed to be taking cultural stuff that had been produced and doing funky things with it. They had been, they noticed that people were appropriating culture that had been produced, whether it's music or clothing or makeup, any of these things, and were doing interesting things with it that weren't necessarily the things that cultural producers wanted to have happen with them, with the stuff they produced. And a classic example of this, and one of you in the class even said you have some connections to this, is the punk movement of the late 70s, early to mid 1980s. And punk, you can think Sex Pistols, you can Google punk right now and get all sorts of crazy image of what punk people look like, right? Crazy spiked hair, shaved mohawks, earrings, kind of body postures that said certain things, wearing mix and match of clothing, maybe sometimes with certain messages on the clothing or certain initials that wanted to give off certain messages. You get what I'm talking about here. And what the Birmingham School of Sociologists in Birmingham, England in the 1970s, by seeing this punk movement that's happening in England at the time, they start to get on to the fact that, hey, there's something going on with the way that people receive or appropriate culture. So we're not just passive dupes that Adorno and Horkheimer argued that we were, but there's actually a way that when cultural stuff is produced, consumers can do new things with it, can create new identities and even new looks out of these things. So these sociologists studying how people interact with cultural stuff, especially people who kind of resist and appropriate culture in kind of a contrast way with mainstream society, pointed out a number of steps that happen in cultural appropriation. First, they noted that people would kind of pick and choose cultural products, creating a sense of authenticity for themselves. So, for example, in the punk version, they might take a hair dye that was meant for a middle-class woman to have nice red hair, and they might dye the tips of their mohawk spikes with it. And they might take a jean jacket that was meant to be for kind of a casual urban motorcycle rider, and they might cut off and fray the armholes here and then put chains on it, chains that had been meant to lock schoolyard gates or to put around dogs' necks. So you can see the point here, which is that you have these subgroups of people who start kind of picking and choosing components of mainstream culture, and together by picking and choosing things, they're appropriating it and creating their own kind of authentic way of being in the world. These sociologists then noticed what would happen is that these new styles, and that's an important word here, these new styles like punk that came out of it, would have people who would coalesce and together would basically make a group identity out of it. So as it's really clear from simply looking around you in the course of day-to-day life, there's very few people that kind of come up with their own style that's completely, totally on their own. What these sociologists noted was that there began to kind of coalesce people who were making similar choices about the way they looked in the world, and that the way they looked in the world with their style and their dress started to be connected with certain types of music, like the Sex Pistols and punk. And it started to be connected with certain lifestyle decisions. For example, drug use or critical attitudes against authority. And it started to be connected with maybe political stances against militarism or against nuclear warfare and the development of nuclear weapons, against Margaret Thatcher and how she was trying to dismantle the national health system of Britain in the 1980s. So sociologists noticed how the reappropriation of cultural stuff into these styles not only gave a sense of personal authenticity, but gave a sense of group identity. And then they noticed, lo and behold, that pretty soon official mainstream folks, school teachers, cops, politicians, were then latching on to those identities and saying those are deviant. So they were using the group identity that these people had been fashioning, for example in punk, and saying punks are deviant. And punks, they're not only what's wrong with the world, they're causing everything that's bad with the world. So there begins to be this kind of then blowback, if you will, from mainstream culture. And this is all part of this really intriguing way in which culture can be appropriated. Cultural stuff and material can be appropriated. And then they notice, particularly as public authorities started complaining about those dang deviant punks, that this brought more attention to what had been rather small, kind of marginal youth group identity movements. And all of a sudden you have kind of a wider array of people who start doing some of the stuff that is being done by those radical groups. So kids in the suburbs of London, hey man, I'm gonna cut my jean jacket too, or you know what, I'm gonna wear some dark eye makeup, or you know what, I might try some weed this weekend, because I've been hearing that that's what deviant people do. I've been hearing from the police and the ministers and educators and politicians that there's these deviant people going around doing those things, and so I'm going to start doing those things. So you start to have kind of this disconnection between these styles and the actual social conditions that they were connected to, and instead what you have is the styles themselves kind of being picked up by all folks of all different sorts of places and different stripes. And you have the styles kind of become portable, so people can have the look without necessarily have the political attitudes or necessarily making the music or necessarily being hardcore into political activism like some of the punks were at that time period. And then this is a crucial final nefarious step, and the step at which Adorno and Horkheimer might come in and say, aha, I told you so. Told you so. You have industry co-optation. Woo, I'm going to write this horribly here. So co-optation. So by this time you've got the people who make fashion elements or make jewelry or are in those big record making, music making companies look and say, whoa, there's something going on out there. Let's try and co-opt this. I know, we're going to sign up a whole bunch of alternative bands, much like we read about in the Tom Frank article last week. And we're going to latch on to this new style, and we're going to mass produce it, and we're going to make a ton of money out of it. And so you have this kind of full circle coming of which something that was created by playing and appropriating cultural stuff in a way that it was never meant to be done by cultural producers has come full style to now the cultural producers are picking back up on it and now pumping it out as something as basically mainstream culture. You can actually go through this cycle with a whole bunch of things, a whole bunch of different kind of subcultural movements over time and see how it works. For example, rap music. Did you know that rap music by this day and age, and this has been happening for about a decade now, the biggest or the largest segment of purchasers of rap music are white middle class suburban kids. Rap music originally connected with an appropriation and an authenticity, then a group identity of resistance against police abuse or income inequality, or breakdowns of services in cities, so a resistance against that, became marked as deviant, especially by the late 1980s by all sorts of authorities. And then, lo and behold, was picked up on by music companies, by clothing companies, that then could co-opt some of that rap style and then mass produce it and make it feel much more mainstream thing. Now, this is not to say that rap music and those who made it, especially at the beginning, are themselves co-opted in their message or in their own politics, but instead to show and to say that that it becomes picked up by mainstream cultural producers who pump it back out. We could even wonder if the same thing has happened with hipsters today, but I'm going to leave you with that thought for you to think about on your own, and you think about how these kind of steps in the appropriation of culture, how it happens and how it comes back around to central cultural producers themselves, can then actually take what had been these subcultural deviant movements and kind of mix it all back up and package it and sell it back out as mainstream culture. And I'll insert a slide right here. Boop. Which is a great PBS website that shows exactly how that happened in the 1990s with this alternative thing that we read about in the Frank article. In particular, how the rock group Limp Bizkit, if you look deep enough in these PBS files in the link, you can see it on that slide, how the group Limp Bizkit was very much a wise or a cynical creation of a large bureaucratized media company to really try and sell more records and more stuff because they could sell it to the mainstream. So I'll leave it at that for now. There's a quiz this week, don't forget, and as always, email me if you got questions. All right, take care.